If you bought an official map of the Soviet Union in the middle of the Cold War, you would find every road, every river, and every provincial town meticulously detailed. Soviet cartography was famously precise. But if you took that map and traced your finger down the eastern slope of the Ural Mountains, just north of the Kazakh border, you would slide right over a void. According to the paper, there was nothing there but a deep expanse of pine forest and a chain of cold, dark lakes. But beneath your finger, in that empty green space, lived 100,000 human beings. They lived in a sprawling, modern metropolis with wide boulevards, public parks, symphony orchestras, and heavy iron gates that locked them in from the outside world. If a resident of this city had a child, the birth certificate was falsified to show a different town entirely. If they wanted to write to their families, the letters had to be routed through a P.O. box hundreds of miles away. Relatives who lost touch with people moving to this region often assumed they had been swallowed by the Gulag system or were simply dead. The city had no name, only a postal code, Chelyabinsk 4. Oh, to understand why an entire civilization was erased from the face of the earth, you have to rewind to the sweltering summer of 1945. The setting is Potsdam, Germany. The ruins of the Third Reich are still smoldering. During a break in the negotiations carving up the post-war world, American President Harry Truman casually walks up to Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. Truman mentions, almost as an aside, that the United States has just successfully tested a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin smiles. He politely hopes the Americans will make good use of it against the Japanese. But behind the serene mustache, Stalin's mind is racing. Thanks to his spies embedded deep inside the Manhattan Project, he already knows about the atomic bomb. He knows the Americans have cracked the fundamental architecture of the universe. What he doesn't know, until the ash falls on Hiroshima a few weeks later, is just how fundamentally the balance of global power has shifted. Suddenly, the vast million-strong Red Army looks obsolete. America has a sword hanging over Moscow, and the Soviet Union has no shield. Stalin summons the most terrifying man in his inner circle, Lavrenti Beria. Beria is the head of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. He is the architect of the Great Purge, a man who has sent millions to their deaths with a flick of his pen. Now, Stalin gives him a new assignment: build a Soviet atomic bomb. Whatever the cost in blood, gold, or time, build it. Beria approaches the atomic project the only way he knows how, with absolute secrecy and ruthless industrial brutality. To build a bomb, the Soviets don't just need brilliant physicists, they need plutonium. And plutonium does not exist in nature. It has to be cooked into existence inside a nuclear reactor, atom by atom, through a highly toxic, fiercely dangerous process. To do this, Beria orders the construction of a massive industrial complex, completely hidden from American spy planes and saboteurs. They choose a site deep in the Ural Mountains, a natural fortress of rock and dense taiga, situated by the shores of Lake Kiziltash. It is isolated, freezing, and practically invisible. In late 1945, the first trains arrive in the snow. They do not carry scientists, they carry slaves. Over 40,000 inmates from the Gulag system are offloaded into the biting wind. Under the barrels of machine guns, these political prisoners, captured soldiers, and ordinary criminals are handed shovels and told to dig the foundations of a nuclear facility into the frozen earth. Thousands die of exposure, starvation, and exhaustion. They mix concrete with their bare hands in sub-zero temperatures. They carve out a vast subterranean labyrinth and a sprawling surface facility that will come to be known as the Mayak Production Association. Adjacent to the factory, the prisoners build the city. Chelyabinsk 40 is designed to house the physicists, engineers, and plant workers who will operate this terrifying new machinery. By the time the scientists are brought in, the city is a surreal paradox. The rest of the Soviet Union is starving, crippled by the devastation of World War II. Bread lines stretch for blocks in Moscow. But inside the barbed wire perimeter of Chelyabinsk 40, the grocery store shelves are overflowing. The residents are showered with luxury. They have access to fresh fruit, imported clothes, rich chocolate, caviar, and top-tier medical care. They are given generous salaries and beautiful apartments overlooking the lakes. It is a golden cage. The state provides everything they could ever want, on one condition: they can never leave. They surrender their passports upon arrival. They sign non-disclosure agreements, where the penalty for speaking a single word about their jobs is a bullet to the back of the head. They become a shadow population, a designated Zato, a closed administrative territorial formation. To the outside world, they cease to exist. At the heart of their new world is the A1 reactor, affectionately and bizarrely nicknamed Anushka. Designed by the brilliant and exhausted chief scientist of the Soviet nuclear program, Igor Kurchatov, Anushka is a towering cylinder of graphite blocks and uranium rods. In June 1948, the reactor goes critical. The chain reaction begins. The uranium atoms split, releasing furious heat and a deadly barrage of neutrons, slowly transmuting a tiny fraction of the fuel into weapons-grade plutonium, 239. Beria's deadline is suffocating. The Americans are stockpiling their arsenal, and the Soviet leadership is gripped by the paranoid certainty that a preemptive nuclear strike on Moscow is imminent. There is no time to test safety protocols. There is no time to build adequate shielding. Production targets are the only things that matter. When uranium rods jam inside the reactor, engineers are ordered to climb to the top of the core and pull them out manually. Men are exposed to lethal doses of radiation in seconds. They are given a shot of vodka, a pat on the back, and a transfer to a hospital where they will quietly bleed to death from the inside out over the next 3 weeks. Their bodies are buried in lead-lined coffins, their deaths classified as vegetative syndrome to keep the panic down. But the danger isn't just to the men pulling the rods. To keep the furiously hot reactor from melting down into a puddle of radioactive slag, it requires a massive, continuous flow of coolant. The engineers build a system that pulls millions of gallons of water directly from the nearby lake, pumps it straight through the highly radioactive core of Anushka, and flushes it out the other side. There are no filters. There are no holding tanks. The boiling, heavily contaminated water is simply pumped directly into the Techa River. The Techa is a slow, winding waterway that flows eastward out of the Urals. It is the lifeblood for dozens of farming villages along its banks. Hundreds of thousands of peasants rely on it to drink, to bathe, and to water their livestock. The scientists in Chelyabinsk 40 know exactly what is pouring out of the factory's discharge pipes. They can read the dosimeters, but the orders from Moscow are absolute. Do not stop the reactor. Inside the borders of the city that doesn't exist, the air begins to carry a strange, metallic tang. It is the taste of ozone and irradiated dust, a silent indicator that the relentless push for the bomb is poisoning the very environment they inhabit. But the residents of Chelyabinsk 40 are insulated from the worst of it. The true horror flows downstream. 20 miles away, in the farming village of Musliumovo, the Techa River begins to run cloudy. Fish float to the surface, their bellies white in the sun. The local villagers, exhausted by years of severe post-war rationing, haul them in by the net full. They are thrilled by the easy catch, completely unaware that the meat they are frying for their children is laced with strontium-90 and cesium-137. Soon, the physical symptoms appear. Teenagers start losing their hair in clumps. Elderly farmers develop agonizing, weeping lesions on their legs after wading into the shallows to fetch water. Women suffer an epidemic of miscarriages, and children are born with severe deformities. When local doctors report a sudden, terrifying surge in leukemia and aggressive radiation sickness, the Soviet secret police swoop in immediately. The doctors are threatened with imprisonment if they speak out. Patient medical records are confiscated, and the official diagnosis is legally changed to a fabricated, vague condition called weakness disease. The river is not fenced off. Evacuating the downstream villages would draw military attention, and drawing attention to this remote region would violate Lavrenti Beria's absolute decree of secrecy. Instead, the state simply watches. The peasants become unwitting test subjects in a massive, undocumented experiment on the effects of chronic radiation exposure. They are left to drink the water, bathe in the current, and die. Inside the heavily guarded perimeter of the Mayak complex, this human sacrifice pays off. By the summer of 1949, the scientists refine exactly enough weapons-grade plutonium to forge a single, spherical core. It is carefully packed into an armored train and transported to the arid steppes of Kazakhstan. On August 29th, the sky tears open. The flash of first lightning, the code name for the first Soviet nuclear test, blinds the morning horizon. Stalin finally has his shield. The American monopoly on the atom is broken. Back in Chelyabinsk 40, the mood is ecstatic. The scientists and engineers are hailed as national heroes, awarded the Order of Lenin, and given massive cash bonuses. They have saved the motherland from what they believed was an imminent American nuclear strike. But the celebration masks a quiet, deadly crisis, compounding back at the factory. The Cold War is now escalating into a full-blown arms race, and the Mayak complex is the engine of the Soviet arsenal. The original A1 reactor is pushed well beyond its safety limits, and 5 more reactors are rapidly constructed alongside it. With every ounce of plutonium extracted, thousands of gallons of highly radioactive liquid waste are left behind. The contamination in the Techa River eventually becomes so extreme that even the ruthless Soviet leadership realizes it might threaten the physical operation of the facility itself. So, they pivot. They begin pumping the mid-level radioactive sludge directly into Lake Karachay, a small, stagnant body of water practically in the city's backyard. Over the coming years, this lake will absorb so much radioactive material that standing on its shore for a single hour will deliver a lethal, agonizing dose of radiation. It will quietly become the most polluted place on planet Earth. But the high-level waste, the boiling, highly volatile chemical byproducts of the plutonium extraction process, cannot simply be dumped into a lake. It requires heavy containment. The engineers build a series of massive underground storage tanks. These enormous steel vats, each capable of holding nearly 80 tons of liquid waste, are encased in thick concrete vaults and buried deep in the earth. Because the radioactive decay generates intense, perpetual heat, each tank is fitted with a complex system of internal cooling pipes. Millions of gallons of water are pumped continuously around the steel walls to keep the liquid sludge from reaching a boiling point. Fast forward to 1957. The secret city has grown immensely. Tens of thousands of people now live in this closed utopia. They go to the cinema, send their children to well-funded schools, and shop at heavily stocked markets, willfully ignoring the strange illnesses that occasionally claim their coworkers. The cognitive dissonance is a survival tactic. The Mayak complex is a humming industrial behemoth, and to question its safety is to question the Soviet state itself. But beneath the ground, in the high-level waste storage facility, something is going catastrophically wrong. The cooling pipes wrapped around a vat known as Tank 14 are corroding. Decades of harsh chemical exposure and intense radiation have eaten away at the metal. The monitoring equipment in the control room, installed years ago during the rushed, frantic construction of the late 1940s, is failing. Production quotas consistently take priority over maintenance, and replacement parts are constantly delayed. One day, a sensor shorts out. The cooling water feeding into Tank 14 slows and then stops flowing entirely. Inside the vast steel vat, the temperature begins to climb. The radioactive sludge simmers. Without the cooling water to draw away the heat, the liquid bakes, slowly boiling off the water and leaving behind a thick, dry crust of highly explosive ammonium nitrate and acetate. For weeks, the pressure builds in the dark. No alarm sound in the control rooms above. The workers walking on the concrete slabs have no idea that beneath their boots, Tank 14 has turned into a subterranean pressure cooker. The temperature inside breaches 600 degrees Fahrenheit. The dry chemical salts are now incredibly unstable, just waiting for a single spark to ignite. On the late afternoon of September 29, 1957, as the residents of Chelyabinsk 40 are leaving the factories, walking their dogs, and sitting down to Sunday dinner, a fault in the control wiring near the tank finally arcs. The spark catches the dried, highly combustible nitrate salts, triggering an immediate and catastrophic chemical detonation. The force of the blast is roughly equivalent to 70 tons of TNT. It rips through the subterranean vault, instantly vaporizing the steel tank and violently ejecting the 160-ton concrete lid, hurling it high into the autumn sky. A towering, suffocating plume of radioactive dust, ash, and chemical debris erupts miles into the atmosphere, carrying with it 20 million curies of radioactive material. The earth shakes violently. Windows shatter across the city. But what the residents of Chelyabinsk 40 notice most is the sky. As the sun begins to set, the atmosphere above the Mayak complex glows with an eerie, luminescent violet and purple light. A few days later, a local state-controlled newspaper will publish a brief, heavily censored article claiming the region was simply treated to a rare southern display of the aurora borealis. But this is no natural wonder. It is a massive radioactive fallout cloud catching the dying light of the sun. The wind drags the toxic plume northeast, stretching a deadly shadow over nearly 8,000 square miles of lakes, pine forests, and agricultural land. The silent ash falls like gray snow. It settles on the leaves of the taiga, turning the pine needles a sickly, rusted red before they wither and die. It coats the roofs of peasant cabins. It seeps into the soil just as the autumn wheat is being harvested. This nightmare will eventually become known to the world as the Kishtim disaster, named after a nearby town, because the actual epicenter, Chelyabinsk 40, does not exist on any map. It stands today as the third worst nuclear disaster in human history, surpassed only by Fukushima and Chernobyl. And yet, the Soviet response is absolute, uncompromising silence. Rather than issue a public warning, the military quietly cordons off the most contaminated zones. In a desperate bid to hide the disaster from Western intelligence, authorities evacuate roughly 10,000 peasants from the hardest-hit villages over the next 2 years, ordering them to bulldoze their own homes, shoot their livestock, and burn their clothes before loading them onto trucks. But hundreds of thousands of others, living just outside the immediate evacuation zone, are left completely in the dark. They are given no explanation for the sudden military checkpoints, no medical warnings, and no clean water. Inside the golden cage of the secret city, the illusion of safety finally shatters. The residents are mobilized into emergency decontamination crews. Heavily pregnant women and young engineers are handed mops and ordered to scrub the streets, the sidewalks, and the sides of buildings with soapy water, washing the radioactive dust directly into the storm drains. Yet incredibly, the Mayak plant never stops operating. The reactors keep humming. The plutonium production continues. The residents are too terrified of the secret police to strike, and too dependent on the luxurious lifestyle the state provides to flee. They simply wash the streets and go back to work. Decades pass. The Soviet Union collapses. The Cold War quietly ends. It isn't until the early 1990s that the Russian government finally acknowledges the existence of the secret cities. Chelyabinsk 40 is given a real name, Ozyorsk, and officially appears on a map for the first time in half a century. But the scars on the land are permanent. Lake Karachay, the dumping ground for the facility's worst liquid waste, became so deadly in the ensuing decades that simply standing on its shoreline would kill a man. When a severe drought in 1967 dried out the lakebed, the wind swept the highly radioactive dust across the region, poisoning thousands more. The government eventually spent years filling the entire lake with thousands of hollow concrete blocks just to keep the sediment from blowing away. The tragedy of this erased city is not merely a story of a scientific experiment gone wrong. It is a terrifying case study in what happens when a state views its own citizens as expendable resources in the pursuit of absolute power. The Soviet leadership was so consumed by the fear of an external threat that they built a doomsday machine in their own backyard, destroying the very land and people they were supposedly trying to protect. They believed that by drawing a blank space on a piece of paper, they could bend reality to their will. They believed secrecy was a shield, but secrecy does not neutralize poison. It only ensures that when the poison inevitably leaks, those standing in its path have no idea it is coming. Today, Ozyorsk remains a closed city. It is still fenced off, still guarded by armed checkpoints, and still home to nearly 80,000 people who live and work in the shadow of the Mayak plant. The atomic weapons that were so frantically forged in those mountains never destroyed the world. But for the ghosts of the Techa River and the forgotten farmers buried beneath the Urals, the end of the world arrived right on schedule. If you found this descent into the hidden shadows of the Cold War compelling, please subscribe and leave a like on this video. Let me know in the comments if there are other erased cities, suppressed historical events, or forgotten projects you want us to uncover next. Your support is what allows us to keep bringing these vanished pieces of history back into the light.